Okay, so one key thing that we're going to be reviewing and using a lot in this class is the term variables, right? Now, what is a variable? A variable is something, according to your textbook, that varies. That's not very helpful, right, in terms of understanding what a variable is. That's why I have the SpongeBob, the more you know. A variable is, another term for variable is factor. So a variable is a factor that we believe impacts our dependent variable of interest, right? So in this example I have here, educational outcome or attainment in the Los Angeles area, if that was our DV of interest, right? How would I state this? If educational attainment is our variable of interest, the variables in that study would be anything we think that impacts educational attainment, right? So factors that influence or are related to educational outcomes, right? So think about that. What could that be? That could be income level. That could be the school district that you live in, right? Or the community you live in. That might include, think about what else could influence educational attainment. Individual characteristics in that student. Are they used to, or are they comfortable with sitting down for long periods of time? And do they tend to follow directions in class? In especially low-income areas, that's seen as being a good student. So can they appear and look like a good student to teachers in the school district, right? So I guess another factor would be, well, what is a good student in that school district? So all these factors that may influence educational attainment, also parents' education level, right? All these factors are variables within our study. I prefer to think of them as factors. It makes more sense to me, but you could think about it either way. Now, within the study design, there are different variables we care about. They're the variables we are actually studying, right? So the independent variable might be parents' education level, and the DV might be the same one I have here, educational outcome. But you might have other variables that actually you don't care about and might make it more difficult to observe how parents' educational level relates to educational outcome, such as the quality of the teachers or pollution. It's going to be hard to understand that connection if you have children with poor health. That's why I brought up pollution, right? If they have poor health compared to other students in other districts, well, that might be also impacting educational outcome. So anyways, variables play into our study in various different ways. Keep that in mind. The IV is a variable. Different factors that might influence our outcome are also variables and might make it more difficult for us to understand the relationship between our IV of interest and our DV. Now, in terms of levels, hopefully you all get this, but so in levels, I'm referring to the levels of an independent variable. Now I'm going to start there. I'm not going to go into levels across different variables. I'm going to focus on independent variables. So independent variables do have levels, and these levels are variations within that independent variable. So for example, if I have Mario here, and my study is looking at, well, how does temperature impact how well Mario is able to complete this level? Well, I might have two levels. I might have a really hot level, the lava level, and I might have an ice level, a really cold level. Those are two different levels of my IV, which would be temperature, right? So looking at the IV of temperature, what are the different variations within temperature? Two: lava and ice. Within your studies, consider that. What are the different levels within the independent variables that you're using in your study? For some of you, you might be using gender, you might be doing heterosexual or LGBTQ as gender identities. I'm not sure if I said gender identities, but let's say we use gender identities, right? And you had 2 different categories that the participants could choose from, LGBTQ or heterosexual. Those would be 2 levels, 2 categories within your IV, right? We could argue that there's more gender identities, and of course there is, but within the way you defined, within your study, how you defined the IV, you only had 2 levels. So keep that in mind. It's very particular to how the study was designed. It has nothing to do, or it has less to do with the real world than you would think, right? We're really focusing on how the study was designed. And actually it should relate to the real world, right? But we're not getting distracted by that. We want to see, well, how many levels did we actually include in that study design? So remember, IVs should have at least 2 levels. In this case, we had 2 levels of lava and cold, or here I have hot and cold listed. Keep an eye out for that, right? When we're referring to levels, this is what we're referring to. It's different from conditions. For conditions, we're actually referring to, well, the possible situations your participants can participate in, the situations you created in your study, right? I'm trying to avoid saying conditions. It's very hard. So it's the conditions you have in your study design. Now, it's not the same thing as levels. Levels is focusing on those IVs specifically, and you should at least have 2. You might have more, but you at least have to have 2. Whereas conditions are related to the levels but different. So let me show you here. Let me get my cursor out, if I could find it. Okay, actually let me exit full screen. It's not letting me show the cursor because of that. Okay, so here you have 2 IVs, time of day and caffeine, right? And time of day has 2 levels, morning and afternoon. So let's say I was interested in seeing, well, how does a time of day my students take an exam impact their score, right? So my DV is their score on an exam. So students' score on an exam is my DV. But let's say I was also interested on, well, I love caffeine. I'm interested in seeing, how does caffeine impact students' scores? Maybe I feel that it might help students have more attention and be more aware. Maybe I have the opposite hypothesis. Maybe I think it might be detrimental to their performance. So I've included caffeine as an IV. It has 2 levels. Coffee is just a normal cup of coffee, which has about 5 milligrams of caffeine. And decaf, it's a decaf cup of coffee, which still has some caffeine, but very little, right? So I'm interested in seeing, well, how do students perform on my exam when they've had a normal cup of coffee versus having had very little coffee or no coffee, right? So here you have 2 IVs, each with 2 levels. Keep that in mind. But then when you draw it out like this in a 2x2 diagram like this, or table, you'll see that you have more than 2 conditions. You have one condition where you have a coffee morning. Sorry, my daughter just passed by. You have participants taking a cup of coffee in the morning. You have one condition when participants are taking a decaf cup of coffee in the morning, and you have one condition where participants are taking coffee in the afternoon, and one with decaf in the afternoon, right? So when you cross these IVs, you actually have more conditions than just 2. You might have 2 levels per IV, but you have more than one condition or more than 2 conditions for the study itself. So keep that in mind. Levels and conditions are separate. When you're thinking about levels, only think about one IV and look at that one IV and see, well, how many different variations of that IV are there. For time of day, we have morning, afternoon, 2. For caffeine, we have coffee, decaf, 2. But let's say I added green tea. Let's say we had green tea here. That would have 3 levels. Did I say conditions for time of day? I meant levels. Keep that in mind. Now, for conditions, we actually have to look at, well, how many situations have you created in your study for your participants to participate in? When you have more than one IV, you have to cross them, right? It wouldn't make sense to not to have this a second IV if you're not going to do that. So here you have caffeine crossed with time of day. There she goes again. So you have caffeine crossed with time of day, and when you do that, you come up with 4 different conditions, different from levels. And each condition has 1 level from each of the IVs. Now, in many of the examples we're going to be going through and that I'm going to be giving you and that the textbook gives you early on, they're focusing on study designs that only have 1 IV. So let's say I had a study design where I only have coffee with 2 levels, coffee and decaf, right? That's fine. I only want to compare how caffeinated students and decaffeinated students do on an exam. You can do that. In that situation, you have an IV with 2 levels, coffee and decaf. And only in this situation, when you have 1 IV, do the number of conditions match the number of levels in your IV. So again, we have 2 levels for caffeine, coffee, decaf, right? And because we only have 1 IV, we have 2 conditions, coffee, decaf. Here we had, on the original example I gave you on this slide, you had 2 IVs with 2 levels, 1, 2, 1, 2, but you had 4 conditions because they cross, 1, 2, 3, 4. So keep in mind, sometimes when we're discussing this study design that only uses 1 IV, we're going to go back and forth between using levels and conditions, and it sounds like it's the same thing because in this type of study design, when you have 1 IV, it's a coincidence that they equal the same number, right? And it's only in the case when we have 1 IV. So in your textbook and in my videos and in our discussions, if you hear me going back and forth between levels and conditions for a study design that uses 1 IV, that's why, right? So if you have questions about this, reach out to me. We can go over some examples. I could work out some examples based on your study as well, but the main thing is to reach out to me. Don't feel like you're the only one that has this question. Oftentimes, many students have this question.